One evening, Thomas had just returned to the Tidmouth sheds after a very busy day. His crew had dumped his fire, and he was about to have a snooze when he realized his driver was standing in front of him. He looked down curiously. "Thomas, there's something I need to talk to you about. As you know, I've been your driver for about 30 years now." "Yes," Thomas replied, a bit worried. "Unlike you engines, we drivers can't go in and have a rebuild when we're getting old, as much as we would like to. And I am getting old, Thomas. I'm going to be 55 in a couple of months." "Does this mean you can't be my driver anymore?" "I'm sorry, Thomas. This wasn't an easy decision for me to make." Thomas didn't reply. "I've bid on a job as the station master at Elsbridge. I'll still be around." "Okay," Thomas replied softly. Thomas's driver quietly departed, leaving a sad tank engine behind him. A few nights later, Thomas and Percy were returning from their evening mail run. "Look over there, it's the Fat Controller," Percy said. Sure enough, a familiar, black-suited figure was striding across the yard. It was clear he was heading for Thomas. Thomas quickly thought back over the day, but he couldn't recall putting a wheel wrong. "Good evening, sir," Thomas said as the Fat Controller reached him. "Good evening, Thomas." "Am I in trouble, sir?" Thomas asked. The Fat Controller looked at him for a second, then chuckled. "Not at all, Thomas. In fact, I'm here to speak to Robert Smythe." "My driver?" Robert climbed down and joined the Fat Controller, while Thomas's fireman prepared him for the night. "Robert, I've got some good news for you. You've been successful in your bid for the station master job at Elsbridge." "Thank you, sir. I'll just duck back and let Harry know." While Robert climbed into Thomas's cab to break the news to his fireman, Thomas looked down at the Fat Controller. "Do I really have to have a new driver, sir? I mean, he'll be heavy on my controls, and he won't know the line like I do." "Then you'll be pleased to know you're getting a new fireman instead." "A new fireman?" Thomas asked, confused. He couldn't see how that would work. After all, a steam engine needs a driver and a fireman, not two firemen. "He means I'm being promoted, Thomas," explained Harry, as he and Robert joined the Fat Controller. "Do you mean you've been apprenticing?" "That's right, Thomas. I'll be your new driver." That made Thomas feel a little bit better. Harry had been learning to drive on him, after all. "Your new fireman is named Jeremy Watson. He'll be here tomorrow morning to get you ready." With that, the Fat Controller and Harry left, leaving Thomas alone with Robert. "I've enjoyed being your driver, Thomas." "Thank you. You did a good job. Goodbye, Robert." "Goodbye, Thomas. I'll see you around." With that, he left. Percy looked over sympathetically. "Thomas," he began. "I knew this was coming. Robert told me a few nights ago." But knowing it was coming hadn't made saying goodbye any easier. Early the next morning, Thomas was rudely awoken as he felt someone climb into his cab. "Who's there?" he asked, half asleep. "I'm Jeremy, your new fireman," replied the young man in the cab. "I'm here to get you ready. It's polite to wake me up first, you know." "I'm sorry, Thomas. I'm afraid I haven't really done this before. You see, this is my first proper firing job." That got Thomas's attention. "Your first job? Everything all right, Thomas?" Thomas looked down to see Harry standing in front of him. "This new fireman's only just come out of training," Thomas whispered. "Well, we all have to start somewhere, Thomas, and don't worry, I'll be with him." Thomas had to admit Harry had a point, but he wasn't quite reassured. Thomas was soon steamed up, and he left Tidmouth with his first train of the day. But as he headed towards Dryall, the little tank engine couldn't help feeling a bit worried. He could feel his fire going in his firebox, but it wasn't as strong as he would have liked. To make matters worse, his smokebox was beginning to itch, too. "He didn't do a proper job of cleaning my smokebox, and he could make my fire stronger, too," Thomas grumbled as he continued along the line. There were some boys throwing stones from an overhead bridge. "Hey, stop that!" Thomas called as the stones bounced off his paintwork. By the time he reached Dryall, the itch in Thomas's smokebox had gotten worse, and he was having trouble breathing. He was still having trouble when he left for his return journey. It became worse and worse as he continued down the line, each chuff being harder than the last. Eventually, he limped into Elsbridge Station. "Hello, Thomas." Thomas glanced over at where the station's new station master was standing. Normally, he would have been happy to see his former driver, but right now, he had other things on his mind. "Hello, Robert," he wheezed. "What's wrong, Thomas?" Robert asked. "I'm feeling a little stuffed up," Thomas replied. "What you need is a good sneeze, Thomas," Henry chipped in as he pulled up on the other side of the platform. "I could have used that this morning," Thomas replied, thinking of the boys on the bridge. While the two engines had been talking, Harry and Jeremy had joined Robert on the platform. "Are his cylinder cocks closed?" Robert asked. "Yes, that was the first thing I checked," replied Harry. While the two senior men continued their discussion, Jeremy walked up in front of Thomas. "Thomas, did you say you were feeling stuffed up?" he asked. "Yes, in my smoke box. Are you sure you cleaned it properly?" "Yes. At least there wasn't any soot or ash left when I had finished. Where exactly do you feel stuffy?" "Near the top of my smoke box." Jeremy glanced up at Thomas's funnel, then rejoined the other two men. There was a quick discussion, then Thomas was uncoupled from the train and shunted into a nearby siding. His fire was dropped. Percy quickly arrived and took Annie and Clarabelle. Once Thomas had cooled down, Jeremy climbed up on top of his boiler. Thomas frowned as he felt Jeremy poking around in his funnel with the handle of a broom he'd borrowed from the station. "What are you doing up there?" "There's something blocking your funnel. Give me a minute." A few moments later, he had fished out the blockage and climbed down. He showed it to Thomas, Robert, and Harry. "It looks like one of the stones those boys were throwing," Harry observed. Thomas looked over at Jeremy. "To have kept me going with that blocking my funnel, you must have done a very good job," he said. "I did what I could," Jeremy replied. Thomas was soon steamed up again, and he happily chuffed off to take his next train. As he left, he couldn't help thinking that his new fireman would do a splendid job.